Imagine going in for, a routine medical procedure. You're in that hospital gown, sitting on that crinkly paper on the exam table, maybe shivering a little bit.
Oh, yeah, and the room has that very specific smell,
Yeah, right.
faintly of rubbing alcohol and bleach.
Exactly. And there is this implicit assumption you make in that moment. You just assume that every single instrument in that room, everything that is going to touch you, is perfectly, flawlessly sterile.
Right. I mean, that is the fundamental baseline of modern medicine.
It is, but, and this is what we're getting into today, what happens when the medical tools we rely on are so incredibly complex, like so intricate in their physical design, that the standard hospital-grade cleaning procedures might not actually be enough?
It's an unsettling thought, to be sure. We
Mm.
put blind trust in the process. We just assume a wash tool is a clean tool.
Right.
But sometimes the physical reality of the equipment pushes back against that process.
Mm.
The laws of physics and microscopic biology, they don't really care about our cleaning manuals.
They really don't. And that brings us to the source material for today's deep dive. We are looking at a truly fascinating 5-year study. This ran from 2019 to 2024 out of the University of Kentucky healthcare system.
Yeah, this was a massive undertaking.
It was. The researchers were evaluating something called a post-reprocessing endoscope surveillance program. Now, stripping away the medical jargon, that basically means they were testing hospital scopes, the cameras they use to look inside your body.
Right.
But they were swabbing them after they had been completely washed and cleared for duty, right before they were meant to be used on the next patient.
And that timeline is the crucial detail for this entire discussion.
Yeah,
They are not testing dirty scopes that just came out of a procedure.
exactly. That would be completely different.
Right. They are testing scopes that, according to the rule book, have gone through the ringer and are supposedly, ready to go.
Ready for the next person. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore exactly what is managing to survive that rigorous hospital wash cycle. Why the specific medical scopes we usually worry about the most might actually not be the main culprits here. And most importantly, what all of this data actually means for your safety as a patient. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really grasp the significance of what the University of Kentucky found, we first have to understand the specific cast of characters involved, meaning the scopes themselves, and the specific microscopic threat the hospital was, hunting for.
Right, because there were a lot of them.
Yeah, the study looked at a total of 107 gastrointestinal endoscopes.
And when I read the study, I realized endoscope is like a pretty broad umbrella term. The researchers were actually dealing with 4 distinct tools, right? Each built for a completely different environment inside the body.
Yeah, and that structural difference is going to become very important later on. So first you have ERCP scopes, also known as duodenoscopes.
Duodenoscope.
Right. These are highly specialized tools, primarily used to examine and treat issues deep in the bile and pancreatic ducts.
Okay.
Then you have EGD scopes, which are your standard upper GI workhorses. They're used for looking at the esophagus, the stomach, and the beginning of the small intestine.
Got it.
Third, there are EUS scopes, which are endoscopic ultrasounds. So picture a camera scope, but it also has a tiny functioning ultrasound probe attached to the tip.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, very complex. And finally, standard colonoscopes, which are used for lower GI examinations.
So we have our 107 scopes, but a surveillance program needs a target, right? Like the villain of the story they are looking for in this study is something called a CRO.
Yes. CRO stands for carbapenem-resistant organisms.
That sounds intense.
To put it plainly, these are multi-drug-resistant superbugs. Carbapenems are a class of highly effective antibiotics, usually reserved for severe or high-risk bacterial infections.
So like the heavy hitters?
Exactly. They are often our last line of defense. When an organism becomes resistant to them, our treatment options shrink to almost nothing. These bacteria are incredibly resilient, and they are exactly the kind of microscopic threat you absolutely do not want hitching a ride on a medical instrument from one patient to the next.
Definitely not. Now, to understand how a superbug could possibly survive, we need to talk about what these scopes actually go through between patients. The hospital's methodology here was strictly testing scopes after they went through the manufacturer's cleaning protocol.
Right.
But I don't think most people realize what that protocol actually entails. I mean, it is not just throwing it in a sink with some dish soap.
Oh, not even close. The process of cleaning an endoscope, what the industry calls reprocessing, is mind-bogglingly complex. We're talking about instruction manuals that can run over 100 steps long.
100 steps.
Yeah. It starts at the bedside with a pre-cleaning wipe. Then the scope goes to a dedicated decontamination room. A technician has to manually submerge it, in an enzymatic bath.
And what does that do?
They're chemicals designed to literally eat away biological matter. And while it's in there, they have to take tiny, specialized brushes and snake them down all the internal channels of the scope, literally scrubbing out the inside tubes by hand.
It's like, well, it's like trying to perfectly clean a 4-foot-long drinking straw with a tiny wire brush blindly.
That is a very apt comparison, yeah.
Mhm.
And after that manual scrubbing, the scope goes into an automated endoscope reprocessor.
So like a machine.
Think of it as a highly calibrated medical-grade car wash. It flushes the internal channels with high-level disinfectants, rinses them, and flushes them with alcohol.
And then it's done.
Almost. Finally, the scope is hung vertically in a specialized cabinet with forced air blowing through the channels to dry out any remaining moisture because, bacteria need water to multiply.
Right, right. The dishwasher analogy comes to mind here. Like if you put a standard flat dinner plate into your dishwasher, it almost always comes out perfectly clean. The water hits it, the soap hits it, no problem. But if you put in a complicated blender piece, like the base with the blades, the little rubber gaskets, all those tiny nooks and crannies.
You know where you're going with this.
Right. Sometimes you pull it out and find a chunk of dried smoothie still stuck right under the blade. The machine did its job, the water was boiling hot, but the physical complexity of the item gave the mess a place to hide.
Exactly.
Medical endoscopes are the blenders in this scenario, but obviously a leftover smoothie chunk is annoying. A leftover multi-drug-resistant superbug is a massive problem.
It really is. The physical architecture of these tools inherently fights against the cleaning process. And what makes this Kentucky study so unique is the regulatory landscape.
How so?
Well, current U.S. guidelines do not actually mandate routine surveillance sampling. Hospitals are strictly required to perform that 100-step cleaning process, yes. But they aren't federally required to regularly swab the scopes afterward to double-check their own work. The University of Kentucky Healthcare chose to implement this active surveillance program proactively.
Wow, so they did this entirely on their own.
Yeah, they spent 5 years actively trying to find hidden breaches in their own disinfection integrity.
They intentionally set a trap in their own hospital to see what they could catch. And the data they got back completely flips the script on what the medical community generally assumes about these scopes. Here's where it gets really interesting.
To appreciate the plot twist in their data, we need a bit of historical context. In the world of gastroenterology and infection control, ERCP scopes, those specialized duodenoscopes for the bile ducts, are notoriously famous.
Famous in a bad way.
Very much so. They are widely considered the hardest medical instrument to clean.
Wait, why is that specific scope so much worse than all the others?
It comes down to a specific piece of engineering called the elevator mechanism. At the very tip of an ERCP scope, there is a tiny mechanical hinge. It acts literally like a microscopic elevator, raising and lowering the wire guides and accessories the doctor needs during the procedure.
Oh, I see.
And because it is a moving mechanical part with hinges, crevices, and microscopic gaps, biological matter gets packed into spaces where brushes simply cannot reach.
So the brushes just miss it entirely.
Right. Bacteria then form biofilms, essentially creating a hard, protective microscopic shell over themselves that completely resists the chemical disinfectants. Because of that elevator design, past meta-analyses have shown a staggering 15.25% contamination rate for reprocessed duodenoscopes.
15%, that's huge.
Yeah, they get all the FDA warnings, the literature focus, the heightened scrutiny.
Okay, so going into a study like this, you would naturally expect the ERCP scopes to be failing the post-wash test the most. I mean, they are the known bad actors. But that is not what happened in Kentucky.
Not at all. In this study, the notoriously difficult ERCP scopes actually had a relatively low positivity rate. When they were tested on a weekly routine basis, they had a 9.6% positivity rate.
Okay, lower than 15.
And when they were tested specifically after being used on a patient known to have a superbug, what the study calls targeted surveillance, they only had an 8.7% positivity rate.
Wow.
Most importantly, there were 0 instances where a bug found on a supposedly clean ERCP scope matched the specific superbug of the previous patient.
So the worst scope actually performed quite well under pressure. But here is the massive red flag in the data. The EGD scopes, the standard ones used for upper GI procedures, the ones without the complicated elevator mechanism, had a massive 25.9% positivity rate.
Yes.
They tested them 189 times, and 49 of those cultures came back positive for contamination. That's a quarter of them.
And the surprises don't stop there. The EUS scopes, the ones with the ultrasound probes attached, had the highest actual match rate in the study.
Match rate meaning?
Out of 3 positive cultures for EUS scopes, 1 was an exact match, meaning the organism they found surviving on the scope exactly matched the superbug of the previous patient. That is a 33.3% match rate.
Wow. And just to round out the data, the standard colonoscopes had a low 5.1% positivity rate and 0 matches.
Wait, I have to stop and push back on this because the math isn't mathing for me at all.
Okay, lay it out.
We just established that the ERCP scope has a microscopic elevator hinge that literally acts as a bunker for superbugs. But the EGD scopes, which lack that hinge, are failing the test at almost triple the rate. How does the simpler tool end up 3 times dirtier? This raises an important question. How much of the contamination is dictated by the design of the tool, and how much is dictated by the human behavior surrounding the cleaning of that tool?
That's an interesting angle.
Right. When we analyze the glaring gap between expectations and reality here, we have to look at the human element and the variables in how the hospital actually ran the program.
So let's dig into those variables. Did they treat all these different scopes the exact same way during the testing phase?
They did not, and that is a massive piece of the puzzle. The biggest variable was the testing protocol itself. Because ERCP scopes have that terrifying reputation for causing infections, the hospital put them on a strict, routine, weekly testing schedule.
Like clockwork.
Every single week, regardless of who they were used on, they got swabbed. But the EGD and EUS scopes were mostly tested under targeted surveillance, meaning they were only swabbed after they were used on a patient already known to be carrying a CRO superbug.
Well, that skews the data immediately. The EGD scopes were primarily being tested in high-risk, worst-case scenarios.
Exactly. But it goes much deeper than just a skewed testing schedule. There is a psychological component at play here, a phenomenon we can categorize as attentional bias or risk compensation.
Okay.
What's fascinating here is that because the entire medical community is on high alert regarding ERCP scopes, the technicians cleaning them are naturally hypervigilant.
Because they know the risks.
Right. The institution has rigorous oversight. The staff knows these specific scopes are incredibly dangerous, and they know their cleaning work on these scopes is being audited every single week.
It's a classic human blind spot. It is like meticulously, intensely scrubbing your sharpest chef's knife because you respect it.
Oh, I love that analogy.
You know exactly how dangerous it is, so you give it your full, undivided attention. But then you just casually, quickly rinse the wooden cutting board because you subconsciously underestimate it.
Right, yes.
Even though bacteria absolutely loves to hide in the microscopic grooves of the wood, you just don't perceive the board as a threat. The intense, focused attention on the ERCP scopes created a psychological blind spot for the EGD scopes.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The technicians were likely following the manual for the EGD scopes, but perhaps without that extra level of exhaustive hypervigilance they reserve for the ERCPs.
Makes total sense.
But we also can't ignore the physics of the EGD scopes themselves. They might not have an elevator mechanism, but upper GI scopes have exceptionally long, narrow internal channels.
So there's still a physical challenge there.
Exactly. If a technician rushes the manual brushing phase even slightly, or if the enzymatic detergent isn't mixed to the perfect concentration, biological film just gets left behind in those long tubes.
Okay, but let's say the technician does everything perfectly. The manual scrub is flawless. The automated car wash machine works perfectly. Is the scope safe then?
Not necessarily. The study's authors are very transparent about unmeasured variables that plague hospitals everywhere. An endoscope might be perfectly sterile the exact moment it comes out of the washing machine.
Yeah.
But it has to be handled, it has to be moved to a drying cabinet, it has to be transported down a hospital hallway on a cart, it has to be stored. All of those steps happen in non-sterile environments. A perfectly clean scope can easily get recontaminated by environmental bacteria in the air or by handling before it ever reaches the next patient.
So we've established that the 100-step protocols aren't a magical shield. And we've established that the scopes we think are easier to clean might actually be slipping through the cracks due to attentional bias.
Right.
I want to do a reality check here. If you are listening to this and you have an endoscopy scheduled for next Tuesday, we need to talk about how much danger you're actually in. So what does this all mean?
Let's look at the actual match rates to put the true risk into perspective.
Yeah.
Across the entire 5-year study, out of the 107 scopes and all the hundreds of tests they ran, they had 61 positive cultures.
Okay.
But out of those 61 positive hits, only 3 were actual matches to patient isolates.
I want to clarify that term real quick. An isolate means the exact genetically identical strain of bacteria cultured from the previous patient, right?
Yes. An isolate is essentially the specific fingerprint of the bacteria. So out of 61 dirty scopes, only 3 actually carried the specific superbug from patient A to the threshold of patient B.
So that's really low.
Very low. That is roughly a 5% match rate among the positive cultures. The vast majority of the contamination they found was environmental bacteria things picked up from the air or the storage cabinet, not the terrifying superbug they were hunting.
That's a huge relief.
And if we look at broader medical literature, outside this specific study, overall, endoscope-associated infection rates are tiny. They are estimated at around 0.2% for gastrointestinal procedures.
That 0.2% figure is very comforting. I mean, you absolutely should not panic before your next endoscopy, especially because of what this specific hospital did with the information.
Oh, for sure.
When they swabbed a scope and found a positive culture, they didn't just shrug and put it into circulation. They immediately quarantined that scope. They sent it back through the entire rigorous washing process again, repeatedly, until it tested completely clean before it ever reached a new patient.
Right, the surveillance program worked exactly as intended. It was a safety net. The system caught the errors before they reached the patient. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, while 0.2% is a statistically tiny percentage, the absolute numbers still matter deeply.
Because of the volume.
Right. Millions of these endoscopic procedures happen nationwide every single year. A tiny percentage of millions is still thousands of potential infections. And the detection of any concerning organism on a scope that is supposed to be flawlessly clean indicates a fundamental breach in disinfection integrity.
It shows there's a crack in the foundation.
Precisely. The process itself is inherently flawed because it relies on perfect human execution on imperfectly designed machines.
So if we can't clean the blender perfectly every time, regardless of how hard we try, what is the medical field doing to fix the root of the problem?
Well, the FDA has weighed in heavily on this dilemma over the last few years. They're increasingly advocating for a radical transition away from reusable scopes entirely.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they want the industry to move toward fully disposable endoscopes, or at least scopes with disposable single-use components, like a removable tip for the ERCP scopes.
The part with the elevator hinge?
Exactly. The logic is bulletproof.
Yeah.
If you use it once and throw it in the incinerator, you entirely bypass the cleaning issue. There is zero risk of cross-contamination.
Okay, the logic is sound for infection control, but my mind immediately goes to the logistics of that. Endoscopes are not cheap pieces of plastic. They are essentially high-tech fiber optic cameras with complex mechanical steering.
Yeah, they're marvels of engineering.
Throwing a highly engineered camera in the trash after a 20-minute procedure sounds like a monumental nightmare.
It is a monumental nightmare, which is exactly why it hasn't become the universal standard yet. The barriers to the FDA's vision are massive.
I can imagine.
Let's start with the environmental burden, which is staggering. If we move to fully disposable scopes for every GI procedure, we would be generating mountains of medical waste every single day. We are talking about throwing away complex plastics, electronic sensors, and rare earth metals used in the camera chips.
Not to mention the supply chain issues of having to manufacture millions of complex medical cameras every year just to throw them away.
Exactly. And then there is the financial cost. Purchasing a new disposable scope for every procedure is vastly more expensive over time than paying technicians to wash a reusable one.
Right.
But perhaps the biggest barrier right now is technological. Disposables simply aren't available with the required optical quality, flexibility, or mechanical functionality for all specialized procedures. The doctors literally cannot see as well with the disposable versions currently on the market.
So we're stuck in a frustrating intermediary phase. We can't consistently clean the reusable tools perfectly, but we can't afford, environmentally or financially, to just throw them away.
That is the exact paradox the industry is wrestling with right now. And it is where the authors of this University of Kentucky study land in their final conclusion.
What do they suggest?
Because the actual transmission rate of superbugs was proven to be so low, they conclude that universal surveillance, meaning swabbing and culturing every single scope after every single wash in every hospital, probably isn't necessary or cost-effective.
Testing every scope every time would probably grind hospital operations to a complete halt anyway. You'd be waiting weeks for lab results before you could use the equipment again.
Oh, it would paralyze the system. Instead, the researchers recommend that hospitals adopt a risk-based or targeted strategy. Focus your active surveillance on the higher-risk scopes, or implement it heavily in institutions where multi-drug resistant organisms are already known to be spreading.
That makes a lot more sense.
Use surveillance as a strategic, intelligent safety net rather than a blanket brute force requirement.
It is a delicate balancing act of risk, cost, and human behavior. To recap the journey we've been on today, we learned that even the most rigorous 100-step hospital cleaning protocols aren't entirely foolproof when dealing with highly complex medical tools.
Right.
We explored how attentional bias, hyper-focusing on the notoriously dangerous ERCP scopes, can create dangerous blind spots, allowing supposedly simpler EGD scopes to slip through the cracks and harbor more contamination.
Which was the big plot twist.
Yeah, and we learned that while the actual risk of getting a superbug from a scope is statistically very low, proactive surveillance programs act as a vital safety net, catching the microscopic errors we can't see.
It highlights a fascinating tension in modern healthcare. Yep. Our medical tools have become so incredibly advanced that they have outpaced our physical ability to maintain them, which leads us with a highly provocative puzzle for the future. If our physical cleaning methods are hitting a plateau, limited by the realities of human error and the laws of physics, and if throwing everything away as disposable is simply too financially costly and terrible for the environment, how will the very physical design of medical tools have to fundamentally evolve to solve this problem entirely? What does an endoscope look like 20 years from now that doesn't need to be washed, but also isn't thrown in a landfill?
That is a brilliant question and a real engineering puzzle to mull over the next time you see a marvel of modern medical technology. You have to wonder how the next generation of engineers will design those biological blind spots entirely out of existence. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, the medical landscape is incredibly complex, and staying informed, understanding the questions being asked behind the scenes, is the absolute best way to navigate it. We'll see you next time.